I'm very appreciative of Ed Cannon, Senior VP of Protection Resources with TNM, and Courtney Klein joining us today. Ed was with us at one of the original events. He was, quite frankly, at one of the largest events in Vegas, ConAgra, one of the last events to actually cancel, right, Ed? Cancel like in the middle of it and ship everybody home when COVID struck way back in the last century, it feels. So Ed and Courtney, welcome today. I'm going to let you take it. Threat and risk assessments, which every planner on this call should write down because it is part of your new responsibility. All right, Ed.
Thanks, Diane. Courtney, would you be kind enough to load our deck so folks can see it? So as Diane indicates, Courtney and I work for a Midtown Manhattan-based full-service security provider called TNM Protection Resources, and we have been connected and friends with Diane for many, many years as a company, and more recently, it's been our pleasure to with Diane immediately following the issues that we had with COVID-19 slamming into our country. So, Courtney, let's move through to the next slide. And as Diane talked about, we're going to be discussing threat and risk assessment. And pretty much what it comes down to is this, that there are so many different threat scenarios, and certainly we've become acutely aware of two significant ones, and one that began about 4 months ago.
Hey Ed, can I stop you midstream here because see where your microphone is, because some people can't hear you. It's not coming through. I just don't want anyone to miss anything. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay.
Yep.
That's okay. In fact, what I'll do is I'll let Courtney, why don't you take over?
That's much better.
That's much better. Yeah.
Okay, good. But at any rate, I am going to introduce Courtney and let her walk you through the first talk about threat and risk assessment for events, meetings, as well as crisis and emergency preparedness. And then I'm going to take you through a case study for that large event that occurred in early March, towards the middle of March, in Vegas. So, Courtney?
Thank you, Ed. So threat and risk assessments are a very important thing that you can perform prior to any sort of event in order to make sure that your organization is best prepared to handle anything that comes your way. Naturally, the first part of a threat and risk assessment is first identifying any kinds of threats that may be faced by the event, by your organization, by the attendees. And generally, these fit into three broad categories, and those are natural, accidental, and intentional. Natural risks include things from Mother Nature, hurricanes, wildfires. This pandemic would certainly constitute a natural risk. These are things that we have absolutely no control over, but we all know are still very, very possible. Accidental threats, on the other hand, are things that are caused by humans typically, but they are not malicious in intent. These are things like power loss, an accidental fire, vehicular accidents, things that are certainly going to be an issue if they arise during your event, but not things that you necessarily need to worry about being more problematic as time wears on. Intentional threats are the ones that we tend to think about most. These are things like terrorism, active shooter events, which until recently was definitely the most prescient concern that most people had. Issues like vehicle rammings and any kind of demonstration or civil disorder that may impact the event. Once you identify these threats that are faced by your event, you then have to go through and try to calculate the risk of these events. Risk is not just an arbitrary number that you sort of pull out of anywhere. There is an equation that you can see here that helps you figure out the actual risk that an individual threat poses. So in order to do this, you would look at the threat that you have identified, and there are going to be multiple for any event, and then calculate the threat times vulnerability times the impact, and that's going to get you your risk.
Courtney,
So,
can I ask you a question here, because I'm
yes.
going to speak like as a planner. So I'm used to, for example, I'm used to the old SWOT analyses, right? Strength, weakness, opportunity, threat. How do you put numbers on, or are there numbers with this formula?
So you can choose numbers. This is actually something where somebody who has a background in threat or risk assessment can be very useful, whether it's a security consultant or someone who just specializes in this in general. Typically, it would be based off of your event. It could be a sliding scale, 1 to 5, 1 to 10, 1 being the, the worst of the situation, 10 being the least problematic, or however you decide to do it. So for example, if you have identified that a car accident outside of your venue could be a threat to your organization, maybe in your scale of threats, that's one that you're worried about, but it's not the one you're chiefly worried about. So you would assign it a number that reflects that. When you're looking at the vulnerability in this situation, you'd have to look at the event as a whole. Is your event at ground level? Is it in a building set far back from the sidewalk? Is your event on the 3rd and 4th floor? These kinds of things are going to be the sort of things you would want to consider when identifying the vulnerability. And then beyond that, you also want to look at the impact. If your event is in a field and there is a car accident nearby, what is the impact going to be there? Potentially very high. If there is damage to the property, damage to people, fatalities, injuries, the impact is going to be much higher than if there is a car accident in the parking lot and your event is up on a higher level. So a lot of it's more of an art than it is a science, quite frankly. So
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
I think we'll have more questions moving on, but let's just interesting. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So once you identify your risks or identify your threats and calculate the relevant risks, you're going to want to use this information to inform everything else that you do from here on out. So this is going to include reviewing security and crisis plans, not only within your organization and maybe within your specific event, but for the venue that you're part of. If you are in a city or municipality that has their own crisis plans, you'll want to consider those as well. And quite frequently, these can be found online. Most municipalities are very good about putting them out for people to check. You'd also want to review the facility itself. If there is a need to evacuate, for example, is there going to be a bottleneck where people might get caught up? Or if they evacuate through the wrong door, is there going to be some kind of issue where they're running into a greater threat? Similarly, not just talking about evacuations, it's useful to know not only the layout of the facility, but any adjacent issues that may cause a problem. So really good, thorough, top to bottom review of where the event is going to be held is going to be necessary. You are, of course, going to want to identify whatever emergency measures are in place already. Most venues are going to have some kind of plan. It might not be very built out, or it might be super built out. You never know. But working with the people who run the venue, who are there all day, every day, they're going to be a really good resource for this. If you are doing this on your own, or if you're working with, for example, some security consultants like T&M, you're going to want to provide or develop some recommendations that will help improve the security surrounding the event based on the threats and risks that you've identified. So, an example that up until a few months ago, everyone was very, very concerned about, and rightfully still should be, would be an active shooter. If there's an active shooter in your event, there's going to be not only reputational damage, but also likely injuries, loss of life. So when you're going through and providing these recommendations, you would want to look at each thing that has been identified, and from there, provide recommendations for it. And you're also going to want to think about what else might be necessary. Tabletop exercises are really good. We'll get into those a little bit later too, but they help you identify the weaknesses in your plan, in your team, things that maybe you had no reason to think about before. So now you're thinking about them, and you not necessarily wouldn't have gotten there without doing a tabletop exercise. And then of course you're going to want to do things like coordinate with local authorities and your venue's security professionals, who will be invaluable tools because, as I said previously, they're there all day, every day. They know what they're doing, and they probably have some kind of relationship with local authorities already. After you do a threat and risk assessment, you can move into the development of your crisis management team and plan. basic crisis management definition is the overall coordination of an organization's response to a crisis in an effective, and timely manner with the goal of avoiding or minimizing damage to the organization's profitability, reputation, or ability to operate. So one of the first things we really need to understand is the difference between an incident, an emergency, and a crisis. An incident is just a thing that happens. It might disrupt operations on different varying levels. And it's important that any event organizer or group of event organizers has the ability to respond to these. An incident may be anything from a crime, someone getting sick, a hazmat spill, a windstorm is going to interrupt operations, some sort of act of terrorism, global pandemic. There are many things that can become an incident. An incident can then escalate into an emergency. And an emergency is an incident that causes or threatens to cause harm to the people at the event. If you think about emergency responders, 911, they're coming in to try to help people stay safe. A crisis, on the other hand, is an incident that might cause damage to the event's reputation or financial standing or operations. So really the primary difference here between an emergency and a crisis is who is going to most likely be damaged. And you can, of course, have an emergency that escalates into a crisis, vice versa, or co-occurring emergencies and crises.
So Courtney, because there's and Ed, there are a couple of questions coming in. Now, typically in a meeting planner, an event planner management role, we have, during the pre-event, we have a risk management meeting where we're introduced typically to the venue or the hotel's director of security. But one comment here is many hotels and centers will not share their emergency plans. If we are meeting in their building, shouldn't they carry the responsibility with regards to exiting a building if there's a fire? I'm confused as to when the client's responsibility comes into plan versus the venue. Who's in charge, Ed?
So I think this, first of all, can you hear me clearly now?
Yes, much better.
Good. So first of all, I think it depends. If you are taking, say, a conference room to host 50 or less attendees, then certainly the level of concern, responsibility that you have regarding emergency procedures of that larger venue is likely more limited than, say, for example, you have an extraordinarily large event where, while it may not be legally your responsibility, and I'll defer to our legal expert colleagues on this platform, but I think that there is going to be a benefit for you to understand and to be able to communicate as appropriate to attendees, exhibitors, speakers, your own staff that's managing the event, what they should do and what they should expect in case of an emergency.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, because obviously in your line of work, there's, like in our line, in any line of work, there's a chain of command, right? So you base the situation. Just one other question before I let you go on is, day one of my meeting, I have the security, or it's more of a comment. Day one of my meeting, I asked the security team at the hotel to do a briefing at the first events to, give everyone else what the chain of command, what the operating procedure should be. So
yeah, so I think that's an excellent practice. It's a good best practice that before the beginning of every event to go over what the schedule is, what occurred yesterday, everything from any current or relevant threats or risks that are arriving. It could be everything from weather to an unannounced, up until now, planned demonstration to the previously unscheduled attendance by a well-known VIP are examples of the types of valuable information that can be shared. It also gives you the chance to do a debrief, a hot wash on how things went yesterday, and to adjust on the fly, if you will, at that quick morning security operational briefing as to what you might be able to do on day two to improve on the way things went on day one.
Thank you. Okay, Courtney, thanks.
Of course. So moving on in the definitions, crisis management is, as the term sounds like, it's an act. It's the event's ability to coordinate a response to any incident, emergency, or crisis in a timely manner with the intent of avoiding or mitigating damage to people, facilities, profitability, everything that we're always concerned about. The crisis management team is the preordained group of people who are charged with and trained to handle such events. The crisis management team is usually going to be the group of people who will go through things such as tabletop exercises. They'll be involved in putting together the crisis management plan. They will be the ones who are going on the walkthroughs of the building, meeting with the security professionals at the venue. That would be the crisis management team. I'm going to go ahead and throw it over to Ed now so he can talk us through a case study from earlier this year.
Thanks, Courtney. So as Diane indicated, we were hired to assist in security planning and crisis or emergency management for a very large international trade show, which was scheduled, as you see, March 9th through the 13th of this year. And those dates should look a little bit familiar because it was, just to refresh your memories, it was on March 10th, for example, that the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic. And lots of other events related to the pandemic and its impact here in the United States occurred during those following days. Let's move on, Court. So you saw the types of threats and that a threat and risk assessment looks at, covered under natural, accidental, and intentional malevolent. And what we did for the event organizers, the event planners, well, we conducted a comprehensive threat and risk assessment because you saw in the slide that Courtney presented, there could be an untold number of potential threats and or risks. And let's face it, you can't protect against everything. So it makes sense to have an assessment done so you can identify the most credible, those that you are most likely to have to face, and then to examine the security program in place to see, are you adequately prepared to mitigate against those identified most credible threats and risks that you face. So in this case, for this particular event, what we determined as to be the potential high-level risk that they face was crime. And quite frankly, when you have, this event was at the Las Vegas Convention Center, both the interior as well as the parking lots were fully utilized. And then the MGM Festival Grounds was a second venue for this same very large event. And while 100,000 people showed up, there were 130,000 that were expected. And the fall off from 130 to 100,000 was largely related to COVID-19, sorry. And what that came down to, it was largely the international travelers who were unable to attend the event, particularly those exhibitors and attendees that were coming from Asia. So we identified crime, active shooter, terrorism, civil disorder, and you see we've highlighted that, and as the intentional malevolent act that could be directed either at the event itself, a particular individual, exhibitor, or attendee, or groups that would be in attendance.
Hey Ed,
And then,
can I just we've got so many comments and questions coming in here, so can I just ask you something on this note?
Sure.
So we're talking about, 100,000 person conference, meeting, event, trade show, everything here, but let's go back to the threat and risk assessment and what your team does. And the whole is, question, what types of meetings typically require this attention to detail? Like, can you give some examples?
So, yeah, you know, a trade show such as this one certainly would. Um, you know, hey, remembering Las Vegas and what occurred there in 2017, which generated, frankly, the level of attention that Vegas now gives towards the threat of active shooter. So any large outdoor type of event, you know, you would benefit, I think, from a threat and risk assessment. Anything that's going to have a large crowd of people, and when I say large, I mean, you know, anything over a couple of thousand people, is something that can attract a higher risk, if you will, for two reasons. Number one, the threat incident itself, whether God forbid it's an active shooter, vehicle ramming, severe weather, windstorm, earthquake, things along those lines. Regardless of what it is, when you have that many people at a particular venue that are impacted by a negative event occurring, you know, you have to deal with, you know, what have we done to protect those people in attendance from that particular type of identified credible threat or risk.
Right. So if you, so, oh, sorry, go ahead. Sorry about that.
And okay. And number two, the emergency response, should something bad happen, regardless of what it is, the ability for folks to understand, you know, from the event organizer's perspective, what is their responsibility, obviously shared or more largely owned by the venue itself, but what measures are in place in order to assist in evacuation, whether it's a planned evacuation or more likely to happen at a sudden, unexpected negative incident occurring, a spontaneous mass self-evacuation. Think the Route 91 Harvest Country Festival, you know, one of the most, if not the most horrific active shooter incidents that the country's endured. So, you know, for those two reasons, you know, it's important to have that threat and risk assessment. Part of the assessment, by the way, is not just identifying those credible threats and risks, but knowing what measures are in place. And once you have vulnerabilities identified, that, you know, you see you're susceptible to a particular threat, to try and improve the security posture. So that goes back to understanding what the venue is capable of doing. And I know there was a comment earlier that they won't share their security and emergency plans. Frankly, you know, I haven't encountered that. I think if you are going to be using their venue and paying them for that privilege, you have a right to know what security measures are in place at the venue.
Sometimes in my experience too, Ed, is I will meet with the risk management team on site. They'll give me a contact. If I bring in my own director of security, they will talk amongst themselves and then basically just tell the planner what the procedure is should anything happen. But let me just shift over here because we have a lot of questions. If you don't mind, I'd rather this and then go back to this. And this is something that you and I discussed. And by the way, this checklist, there's a checklist that does exist. Ed did a checklist for us a couple of events ago that I will put in the resources guide today, because someone says, I'm a sole business owner. Who would be my crisis management team? Barring that they don't bring you in, does that come from my client? Is it the venue? Is it the city officials, local PD? Do I hire my own people? What do I do? Because think about what we're talking about today. Meeting planners are responsible for risk management. What do you do as an independent?
So I think to answer the question directly in terms of who's on the crisis management team, is it your the the small business event planner or the client. And if by client, what I assume you mean is those that are sponsoring and going to be running the event. And I think that the crisis management responsibility falls more towards them, with you as an event planner being a member of that crisis management team. So, yeah,
So as the planner, be part of that, but if your client is a corporate client, your client is an association, your client is a wedding. There's threats with every kind of live gathering, depending on all of the factors involved.
right. So, it's I don't think any reasonable expectation that an event planner who's is helping to coordinate and arrange a large event for a corporate or private client should be expected to be a one-person crisis management team. By
Right,
definition,
but let's
that
just
can't
say
happen.
this. I'm going to say this just for the few people who are writing in, that maybe they're not responsible, but the meeting planner is responsible for bringing up, for their own good, the concept of risk management. And if it's not being handled, and this is a Jonathan question, an insurance question, how much goes into the contract to protect my staff and my team versus anything that's a live gathering? So I think it's a case by case. Going back to what Courtney spoke about, that formula, right, to determine how much we need. But in today's world, this might just be an extra mark on the checklist.
Right. And that formula is threat, what could happen, vulnerability, how likely is it to happen, and what weaknesses are there that would allow it to happen, and then impact. What would be the result? Those come together to uh, measure your most critical risk that you face and should be trying to address.
Right, and I think just going back to what Courtney was speaking about with the formula there is, I think there's two, and Ed, Courtney, help me with this. There's two components basically of any kind of analysis. One is the physical building and the environment and the threats, and then one is the people, right? So you have those two different focuses, don't you?
Yeah, that's certainly true. And it's not just the venue itself, but it's also, I think Courtney referenced, you have to look at adjacent facilities. What's nearby that could impact as well. And you take kind of a holistic approach, particularly for the larger events. And if I think that those folks that we're together with today have all been at events where they've never thought of deploying, let's say, for example, weapons screen, to be part of the security process to get in. And they've probably also been part of, or at least know of, events where you wouldn't think of holding the event without doing weapons screening for that particular event. And there are many large events. Think of professional sporting events, whether it's baseball, football, basketball, hockey. All the venues that host these by league standards are now requiring weapons screening before they go in.
I think what
And
you're bringing up is a very important topic, Ed, and it's coming up here. And to everyone who's commented in questions, again, we will address all of them. But I think there has to be extra measure now on security and risk management within the hotels and the venues we work with, and just what kind of plan exists to make sure. Because the bottom line is, as someone pointed out, and I agree with you, Lisa, is when something goes wrong, all eyes are on the planner if there's a program. So, Ed, I know we took questions and time out of this. We have to kind of wrap this up. Is there one statement you can make just with your experience on this venue and what you could leave people with? And thanks for answering the questions that came in.
Sure. So, Courtney, I tell you what, in order to do that, let's jump to the last slide.
And we'll share your deck. Yeah.
One more thing. Can we just go, Courtney, go back. I just want to highlight something that we did for this. And when we did the threat and risk assessment, can you go back one more, please? Okay. So this threat and risk assessment, the event was in March, as you see. At the end of January, you see the date there, and this is about COVID-19. At that time, there were 450 cases, at least reported, by the Chinese government, and 17 deaths. One case confirmed in the U.S. And that, you know, what we ended up saying, as you can see, is that, you know, that we already were watching to see what was occurring in China and pointing out, hey, there's going to be 100,000 people. Here are some things you can do to remain safe. And look, the Center for Disease Control deemed the risk to the American public to be low at that point in time. Go to the next slide, please. However, given the timing 2 months before the event, there could be a potential impact such as travel restrictions, reduced attendance, increased need for medical services. So I think the client was very happy with us, in fact, that we put this on their radar, because it just grew more and more from that point of view. And similarly and timely, given the events, listen, none of us could have guessed that what's going on in virtually every major city in the country could have been predicted 10 days ago. But certainly I think we couldn't argue that it would have a major impact if any of us had an event scheduled in any of these cities. So we also talked about how protest demonstrations can be unpredictable and have the potential to adversely affect operations and individuals that are in close proximity. So just wanted to point that out. Now, Courtney, if you could jump to the last slide. So I pointed those things out just as the value in having a professional threat and risk assessment done. So what should you consider now that we're in this? Hey, we just stated it's important to be able to identify risk and be prepared to handle a crisis. Next. Frequently communicate measures in place that are going to be in place in order to enhance the confidence of all that are involved. Next. Measures such as physical distancing, masks, thermal screening are likely to be requirements for at least the near to midterm future. And next. So contingency plans like handling incidents where a participant exhibits symptoms or tests positive. That was lots of questions early on about what the responsibility is. Identify that beforehand. You shouldn't be making that up on the fly as it occurs. And lastly, develop crisis management plan and the crisis management team to facilitate effective response and recovery. The bottom line is you can't possibly have every threat covered by a written protocol and document. What a crisis management team is able to do, regardless of what the incident is, they are able to effectively and promptly communicate, make decisions, and touch base with all the affected stakeholders in order to be able to resolve the issue as quickly as possible. And very important, at this moment in time, we are focused on COVID-19. We are now focused on civil disorder. If and when you have an event, don't get caught up in what the threat and risk at that moment in time is, to the exclusion of everything else. Make sure you understand what all your credible threats and risks are, and those most likely to happen, and to address those.
Yeah. So, so Ed, just to wrap up here, because there are planners and there are people online right now who have one extreme situation to another, who have clients who say, no, we're not going to meet this year. We're going to plan a virtual meeting, figure it out. Okay. And then we have people online who just shared with me that said, no, we're going to absolutely do an in-person meeting. Live, forget it, just keep planning it. Now, what I'm thinking that we can ask everyone to leave with from this is the following. If you can show and demonstrate the risk assessment that's involved with either live or hybrid or both, then you are giving people food for thought so that they can look at something on paper and make a decision. If we go back to the formula of the threat and risk assessment, and someone sees that on paper and they have time to think about it, and we look ahead and you get information from a reliable source, that helps. The other thing, Ed, that everyone's asking for is the checklist. So we'll look at that checklist we did about a month or two ago, and see how we can add to it given today's climate. Can you give us a quick wrap up before we bring on our next speaker?
If I was an event planner, what I would be doing is I would find where I can track two major things. Number one, where I want to have my event. I want to understand what are going to be the state and local governments' requirements, guidelines, recommendations that I'm probably going to have to comply with, and have an understanding, is that something I'm able to do, or should I perhaps look for somewhere that is not going to be perhaps as difficult to run my event because they're so heavy with the restrictions. For example, thermal screening. Depending on the size of your event, going to be very, very difficult to do that. Contact tracing. We've talked about what a headache that can be. So understand that different states and different jurisdictions are going to have different requirements, recommendations, and regulations. Number two, I'm going to be tracking the incident level of COVID-19. How many people are getting sick where, how many being hospitalized, how many deaths are there. And I think there's a good chance that different locations are going to be experiencing different spikes at different moments in time. So tracking that as an understanding of how my event might be impacted, understanding the level of virus in the area where I want to hold the event, and as well as, if I can, identify where my attendees are coming from also. So these are the types of data gathering and analysis that I don't think we had to do before, but make a lot of sense now.
They make a lot of sense. And so the only thing I'd leave you with, and one of our attendees shared this online, is to put into your contracts that you expect full disclosure, security, transparency, and what the up to the minute facts are from the people you're working with. Okay, thank you, Ed, thank you, Courtney. I appreciate it.